The Daniel Penny manslaughter case has gone to the jury, so we're awaiting a verdict in that case.
See the prosecutor in that case? Or read about her? I mean, she's as woke can be, so.
Councilwoman Vicky Palladino, New York City Councilwoman Vicky Palladino, tweeted out, I attended closing arguments in the Daniel Penny case today. This was yesterday, of course. To support Daniel and his legal team, what I witnessed was a travesty the likes of which I didn't think possible in the United States. I saw the despicable excuse for a DA stand up in front of court and flagrantly lie for no other reason but to destroy the life of a good man for the quote-unquote crime of protecting a train full of people from a violent, deranged bum. The fact that an angry, disheveled, spiteful woman like that can vindictively wield the law on behalf of our city is an embarrassment to our entire legal system, and it shows how nakedly and unapologetically political the Manhattan DA's office has become. Shame on us for allowing our once great city to descend to this level. I'd call it a clown show, but that would imply there's an element of humor in any of this. There isn't. I only pray that the jury can see through this charade and find Daniel Penny innocent. Either way, the damage has been done, and the message is clear. The Manhattan DA will not think twice about destroying the life of anyone who stands up to criminals in self-defense. We are to be ruled by the lawless. Alvin Bragg has to go, period. And yet the DA that you're talking about, she's talking about Daphne Yoren. Yeah. There's a lot of circulating about her previous, some of her previous casework.
Well, in 2019, she gave a reduced sentence to a black man who murdered an Asian college professor as he was withdrawing $300 from an ATM. She did under the guise of restorative justice and ended up giving him 10 years for manslaughter.
But this is really about Alvin Bragg. And here's what I think is going to happen. And maybe I'm just predicting what I want to see happen.
All right, what?
But I thought the defense made a good close and an obvious one, which is basically to tell the jury, do you want to be on a train with Daniel Penny, or do you want to be on a train with the guy that was threatening everybody that Daniel Penny restrained?
I'm opening the door for Daniel Penny.
Who wants to be? Yeah, who do you want on the train sitting next to you?
Yeah,
now, that's a good way to put people in that moment. But here's what I think is going to happen. I think Daniel Penny is going to be acquitted.
Really?
And
he should be, but
then what's going to happen is Alvin Bragg is going to join Kim Foxx in ignominy. This is what happened to Kim Foxx, and I think Alvin Bragg is right on the cusp of this. And, you know, in New York is interesting right now. We talked about with Eric Adams moving away from the open borders posture of his party. What happened with Fox, what happened with Fox is the new Marxists stopped defending her. Most didn't publicly break bad. Some continued to sort of damn her with faint praise, like our mayor. But in elite leftist circles, where the financiers reside, it was no longer fashionable to utter Kim Foxx's name, much less defend her performance. So she had to be switched out. It started with the primary challenge in 2020. She survived, but basically the story was written that she was not going to be viable for another term, and so she decided to take the stairs instead of the window. Alvin Bragg in this case, and with respect to the Trump case, big dreams he had that led him to go big game hunting. And he's going to be another cautionary tale, just like Kim Foxx, of overreach. Wherein, in this case with Bragg, the Ivy League educated black man didn't realize he's only a mascot for honky leftist elites in New York. If they can't celebrate themselves over their support of him at Shishi Manhattan soirees, then he is of no use. If he makes an uncomfortable spectacle of himself, like a guy wearing cargo shorts and a tuxedo T-shirt to the Met, then he must be banished from polite society. That's what happened with Kim Foxx. That, I think, is in the offing for Alvin Bragg. We'll see. For more on this and matters at the federal level, too, of course, there are many, Andrew McCarthy joins us, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney, contributing editor at National Review, author of the bestseller Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, guys.
Do you share my prediction about the fate of Daniel Penny and Alvin Bragg?
Well, I certainly hope Penny gets acquitted. I think it's cynical the way, not only that the case got brought, which is a disgrace in and of itself, but people ought to realize that, and this is an old prosecutor game, but what Bragg has done here is he's charged him with reckless homicide, which is the manslaughter in the second degree, and criminally negligent homicide. Now, if you look at the case, and again, I want to preface this by saying this is a case that never, ever should have been brought. But even if reasonable minds were to differ on that, it's nothing but a negligence case, pure and simple. The question is, did he keep the chokehold too long, right? It's not a recklessness case. So why did Bragg indict a recklessness count? What he's worried about is if there's some people on the jury who think that something has to be done about Penny because this guy nearly died. If it was just one count up and down negligence, I think Penny's got a very good chance to beat the case. But I think Bragg threw the recklessness case, the recklessness charge in, even though I don't think there's evidence of recklessness here, which is like depraved indifference to a threat of death that you appreciate. There's no evidence of that. I'm annoyed that the judge didn't throw that out at the end of the case. But it gives some of the jurors something to compromise on, where they could end up saying, well, we can feel good about acquitting him on the recklessness, and then we'll go along with the other jurors who want to convict him on the negligence. That's what Bragg is thinking. So I hope that stratagem doesn't work, but I have seen it work before.
Well, we'll see. We're waiting with bated breath for the jury to return. I wanted to get your take, because I know we talked about it, and you had taken a public position in support of Pete Hegseth's nomination, and just sort of where you think that this is at right now. I mean, obviously, Wall Street Journal talking about the Trump team, talking about replacements like perhaps Ron DeSantis. That's not helpful. But if Pete wants to fight this, and Trump backs his play a la Kavanaugh, you think it's worth the fight at this point?
It's really up to this is a very different thing than Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh was a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court, and they thought they had the votes for it. This is a cabinet position for a one-term president who, despite all the grandiose talk about various disruptions and reform, which, by the way, I agree with at least most of it, not all of it. But you have to be realistic here. Trump is going to have 18 to 24 months of running room to get in and do the things that are most important that got him elected, like border security. If he gets bogged down in fights over cabinet positions, he's eating into the period of time where he's going to be able to do the most good. It's just a fact of life in this system that once you hit the 18-month mark, we're going to be into midterm elections. And by then, you're going to see burgeoning fields, this time on both sides, because you have a one-term president. You're going to have big candidate fields that are already starting the 2028 campaign. And Trump, just because of the way the system works, is going to be more and more a lame duck after that. So he's really, to my mind, he's got to hit the ground running. I admired the way that they were very organized this time and up and running, and they quickly got these nominations out. And Trump is already acting as if he is president, and I think affecting things in the world, mostly in a positive way. That's all good. But if he, you can get really bogged down in the Senate. And the thing is, in this instance, it's not up to Pete whether he wants to fight it or not. It's up to Trump how much this is worth it to him. And this is his Defense Department, where you need a lot of work, and he needs someone in there. So, to my mind, as much as I like Pete, I would have picked someone who was an easier confirmation. I understand why he went with the more disruptive guy. I also think that the underestimated thing is that there is a crisis in recruiting in the military, and Pete could be particularly good on that, I think. But it's got to be up to Trump about whether this is worth it to him or not. It's really not whether it's worth it to Pete to make the fight, because it's not Pete's administration.
Right. What about Governor DeSantis as a backup?
Boy, you could have worse. I was surprised to hear that he might be interested in it, but you could have. I think that's a much more fitting job. I kind of chuckled, Amy, when I heard that they were talking about, was DeSantis going to keep this seat warm with somebody, the Senate seat, so that he could take it himself in 2 years? Because he reminds me of Rudy, my old boss, in the sense that he's not a legislator type, even though he was in the House, and I think he was a very effective member of the House when he was there. He's really an excellent executive, and boy, does the Pentagon need an excellent executive. So I think if he's interested in it, the job is much more fitting for his talents than like going to the Senate would be. I also know, he's a pretty young guy with young kids, and it's disruptive to be in Washington full time, and that's been a consideration for a lot of people I thought were very solid, who just don't want to be in Washington if they've got kids in school back, in the states where they live. So that's a tough personal thing. But I think he'd be great if he took it. But I don't want to be misunderstood. I still think that Pete would be a force for good, and if Trump wants Pete, then the Senate ought to give Pete a fair hearing, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and it would be a test for Senate Republican leadership too. Maybe a stress test that Trump doesn't ultimately want at this point, as you say, but there's some value there to that potentially as well. Kash Patel. I mean, I know that I read your piece about ending lawfare, which I agree with, and I think there's divided opinion on whether Kash Patel is a force for ending lawfare or a force for perpetuating it. But I got to say, even though he is very aggressive rhetorically, I mean, he does always come. I mean, he's also an officer of the court. He does always come back to the accountability. We're going to do what they didn't do. Accountability under federal law, bounded by the Constitution. And so, for detractors of Patel, I think they have to address where he comes down, even if he has particular targets in mind.
Yeah, so I have the thing with Kash is I like him personally, and you guys have been kind enough to mention my book on Russiagate a number of times, so that's obviously something that's very important to me. I think he and Devin Nunes were positively heroic in getting to the bottom of Russiagate, and for that alone, to me, unless you had some information like you had with Gates that he had potentially engaged in conduct that was disqualifying, to me, he's presumptively he should be confirmed. My concern, as somebody who's thought very seriously, I think, if I could be egomaniacal enough to say that, about reform at the Justice Department and reform at the FBI. I read Kash's book over the weekend, and I think his reform ideas at DOJ, especially with respect to FISA, some of them are just like flatly wrong and based on like dumb misinformation about how the system works, which actually frankly surprised me because, like, for example, I don't think he understands either how the way FISA is structured and what the fundamental problem is with having a FISA system, having a judicial process oversee something that's not a judicial function. It's a political national security function. That's the main problem with FISA. He has stuff in the book that indicates to me he doesn't know how the judges get appointed. Like he says, the judges are appointed to 1 month terms by the Chief Justice, and that's it's in a statute. They're 7-year terms. That's not how it works. I think what he's talking about is the rotation by which they get
assigned
applications
cases
for
Yeah.
surveillance. But he's just wrong on that. And he doesn't. He says that like, for example, FISA is very important. I've used it when I was a Justice Department national security lawyer to go after bad guys, and I'm like, do you think we didn't go after bad guys before there was? It's not the mission that he's talking about is the collection of national security intelligence, and FISA is a problem with that. It's not a solution to it. It's a hamstring that's been put on that process, and the difficulty with it is that it's not a judicial process. You shouldn't have to go to a court to get permission. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be oversight. There should be very robust congressional oversight of what the FBI does in connection with FISA. And Cash gets around to this in the end of his discussion about FISA, where he says, after all the other things I want to do, I think there should be like occasional checking of the FISA applications by a committee at the Justice Department just to make sure they're on the up and up. But in the meantime, what that should indicate is that the FISA court can't check the FBI, which is why you would need a process like that. And instead, what Cash wants to do is turn it into more of a judicial process. So, for example, he says there should be defense lawyers in FISA proceedings. And so we want to give Osama bin Laden a defense lawyer because a bunch of bird brains at the FBI, mainly in the hierarchy of the FBI, abused FISA to go after Trump several years ago. We should now give defense lawyers to people who actually want to do mass murder attacks and other kinds of sabotage to the United States. That's moronic. So I have big problems with that. Now, I've had policy problems with a lot of people, including, Merrick Garland and every Democrat who gets nominated for these presidential positions. And my main default is that if it's a policy difference and the guy is otherwise qualified and competent, the president's entitled to his nominees. But I have to say, I've read Cash's reform proposals, and I just think a lot of them are just, blah, but some of them would do a lot of harm.
But I mean, I wish we had time to get into FISA more deeply. But just in terms of the politics of this and the policy making, I mean, whatever he wants to do, particularly in this vein that you're discussing, would be tempered by the Attorney General, the Department of Justice, would be tempered by members of Congress.
Yeah, no, you're right. It would have to be legislated. And obviously the FBI doesn't. You're right about that, too. You would think that the Justice Department would be the main source of legal advice to the president on things like FISA reform. But, Cash is going in there as his shtick is he's the reform agent, right?
Yeah.
So his reform ideas ought to be good. And let's say I'm not overwhelmed by them.
Yeah, fair. Andy McCarthy, former chief assistant U.S. attorney, contributing editor at National Review, and author of the bestseller we just mentioned, Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, thank you as always.
Have a great day, guys.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Amy Jacobson and Dan Proft here, and we want to tell you about our 2024 Food for the Poor campaign.
If you've listened to this station and to our show for any length of time, then you already know about Food for the Poor. They're a nonprofit, faith-based organization that provides food, water, medicine, clothing, and life-saving supplies directly to local partners in Latin America and the Caribbean.
We all know how bad the situation is right now in Latin America and the Caribbean.
For many families, the cost of food has simply become prohibitive, leading to sickness and starvation.
The only thing standing between these families and starvation is Food for the Poor. But in order to get this food to those who need it most, Food for the Poor needs your help. Your one-time gift of just $50 can provide life-saving food for a child for an entire year and provide their community with access to water.
To give a gift of any amount, just call 844-862-4673. That's 844-862-4673.
Or you can visit 560theanswer.com/food for the poor